Hello and welcome to Dewey Decimal Classification. This is Class 1 to accompany the slides I've already shared, as well as the quick intro to Web Dewey. So this will be a little bit more general of a presentation. Some of the topics you will have already read in the introduction, but I just kind of wanted to go through some topics and kind of catch you up if you need to catch up a little bit in terms of terminology, and also just to sort of start putting some class content in place. So on that note, just a quick review of what our class week will look like. So each week by Monday, typically, I will put the class presentation materials up. I will put any assignments up, and then I will put up any additional instructions. You do need to participate in the weekly discussion, so post one question or thought or idea or suggestion or thing that puzzles you, whatever it may be, about Dewey or about classification in general. I'm open to talking a little bit more broadly in terms of classification. I know some of you may work with different classification systems at different times in your career, or you may even work with different classification systems within your own library, depending on which project you're working on. If you work in the ILS, you may be working with Dewey, and if you work on a digital repository, institutional repository kind of project, some kind of digital library project, you may work with a completely different classification system in that. So I'm open to thinking about classification topics in the most broad sense imaginable. So post one thought, idea, you know, pondering that you may have, and then also respond to someone. For the first week, I kicked it off by posting a question, but I will not post a question every week. I will chime in on discussion on occasion, but this isn't something where I'm going to ask you a question and then everybody's going to answer me back. It's meant to encourage group discussion. The other thing I want to note about the weekly discussion is you won't get completion or a grade on it until the week 4. So after week 4, at the end, when I'm compiling everything, I actually go in and look at and count all of those posts and see what you've been talking about. So if for some reason you would happen to fall behind, or I know a couple of people have come in later, and if you don't get your post done for this week, you can kind of catch up, you know, towards the end. But I don't want everybody to wait till week 4 to post. That's not the way it works, because you have to respond and post. So weekly, if you can, that's the best practice. But you know, if you do happen to get behind, or you would happen to need to be out of town one week, you can catch up that way by kind of doing the work ahead or behind. So I'm really looking at sort of the overall body of what you participate in the forum. The other thing I want to point out is that you're going to be working with the schedules a whole lot. So most of this class is really about you doing work within the schedules and reading the schedules. It is the only way to learn classification. You really have to get in there and dig into it and spend some time with it. So I will be talking about classification and talking about things, and we'll look at some of the schedules. We looked at a little bit about how WebDewey works, just a little snapshot, but it's really about you getting in there and getting your hands dirty with classification. So you're going to have to dig in, you're going to have to spend some time doing it. I will you know, participate in the forums. I will ask questions. I will help guide that conversation. And, you know, if anyone asks me a question through the forum, I can do that. I'll be glad to answer it. Questions to me about the class logistics really need to go into the announcements area or my office area. So if there's something that you need to ask me about a particular class, or how something's working or not working, post it. You can send me a message. That's fine. I know some people don't want to post those kind of things publicly. That's fine. You can send me a message and I'll get right back with you. And I know a couple of you already done that, and you saw I got right back with you. Or you can post it to that office area and I'll get right back to you too. So both of those come directly to me and I'll answer them there. As I said, you know, the week will be finished for most weeks. This week's a little weird with the holiday, but for most weeks we'll be finished. I will be finished with all the content and everything by that Monday. And you will have a week then to complete that work. Now, I also realize that, life happens and all that kind of stuff. So, if for some reason something happens and you need a little bit of wiggle room, just let me know ahead of time so that I can address that. We will have exercises and assignments. It's going to be a little bit of combination of you actually working with the schedules and then sort of filling in a quiz kind of exercise that's online. So for the exercises that are online that I'm giving you, please do have some scratch paper. You can have the Web DOE open. Please have the Web DOE open while you're working through things, because you need to be able to actually look at your resource and apply it. And that actually will build good work habits. When you're doing classification, when you're assigning, doing that classification process, when you're assigning your notation, when you're doing a cuttering exercise, and we've already had some really good discussion about cuttering and how that happens and how creating these call numbers happens. We're going to be sort of creating them in this ideal kind of bubble, but you will have that sort of practical application that happens in your library. So please just follow the instructions for the purposes of this class. I do realize there's a lot of different styles when it gets down to that granularity of how to continue things, but I'll try to give you a little bit of guidance in terms of how far out you should go in terms of a number and things like that. So I'll try to give you some hints to encourage you to stay on track, because I do know that there's a lot of different ways of applying DOE once you get out past those sort of base numbers and those first few digits. So follow the exercise instructions. Like I said, we're doing sort of a neutral approach here, sort of an ideal approach, and we're not going to cover all those different flavors of how you can apply and cutter there. So follow the instructions, have your scratch paper, have your, you can even do it as a Word document or whatever if you want to do it that way, but you'll need to fill in those little squares on the online exercise. So have some scratch paper or something you can work with, and then do have your Web DOE open, because you're going to be consulting that as you're doing this work. And that's really enough to talk about with the exercises and assignments. So this is Dewey Decimal Classification, Class 1. This is the introduction. And classification, the basics of classification. It's an action or process of classifying something according to shared qualities or characteristics. And this is the Wikipedia definition for library classification, which I think is actually very good. Library classification is a system of coding, and in terms of coding, that's what we call notation. And we're going to look at notation just a little bit in just a few minutes. And then assorting and organizing library materials according to their subjects. So that's sort of that grand vision of what this is. So classification is sort of two pieces. It's the coding. So how do we code or record the information? What is the code for that information? And then what does it attempt to do? It attempts to organize library materials according to their subject. And this is true for the Library of Congress subject headings as well. That's a little bit different coding, but it's still a very similar process to what we do at Dewey. Both of them began in the United States in the 19th century. So, that was a long time ago. And if you've taken some of my other classes, we've talked a little bit of like bias and subject headings and things like that, and how these structures of these classification systems can have a bias sort of built into them and baked into them according to how we arrange materials. We're not going to talk about that so much in this class, as we'll be talking more about sort of the mechanics and the how do you assign these numbers. But it is something that I want you to think about as you're looking at how these subjects fit together and where they fall in terms of the classification schedule. So I do want you to kind of have that in your awareness as we are sort of looking at the mechanics of what we're going to be doing. Another view of what is classification: it provides a system for organizing information. Very, very basic definition there. And this information may be used to organize knowledge in any form. So it can be books, documents, electronic resources. So before we had, before we had MARC records, before we had call numbers and MARC records, we had card catalog records. So we had this information in print. Before we had card catalogs, way back, there was actually sort of print indexes and print books where they actually handwritten books where they actually hand wrote this information in. So, there's different systems in terms of how we record information. There's probably, in fact, I know there are some libraries that still have a shelf list because I worked at one, but there is still libraries out there that use other forms of, other formats of collecting this information and creating this information. A classification scheme organizes subjects systematically and shows their relationships. And so when I talked a little bit about bias just a few minutes, we're not going to talk too much about it. This is the piece of it that I want you to kind of look at when you are digging into those notations, you're digging into those call numbers. As you're putting that call number together, I want you just to think a tiny bit about how the call numbers and the hierarchies show that relationship. And then sort of just an awareness of where there's the potential to have bias. We are working on a lot of this kind of stuff in terms of how we are doing classification. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the future of Dewey going forward at some point, but really just kind of focusing on getting started for today. So what is notation? I've already used the word notation several times. This is a word you will encounter in your readings over and over again and as you work through the schedules. So notation is a system of symbols used to represent the classes in a classification system. Classes being topics, so those topic groups, those categories. You may think of classes as categories. And then symbols, in Dewey, for many of us in Dewey, it's just going to be numbers, right? We just do numbers. For some of you, I know you already cutter in different ways. So maybe you cutter by the 3 digits of or the 3 characters of the author's name. So if you had, if I write a book, it'll be, 6, I don't remember exactly what, 635 something. I think I put myself in animals. 635 something, and then it would be Fay, F-A-Y. Or you may do, 635 and whatever the numbers are, and then you might do F. You might just do the first letter. Or you may do, there are some libraries that'll do nonfiction and fiction. So it'd be NF for fiction, nonfiction, F for fiction, and then part of the author's name. So there's all kinds of different systems in terms of how we kind of cutter or finish out that call number. And that is that system of symbols. So there is no one preference in terms of what Dewey says is the best choice in terms of that very granular organization. You can, as I have done in an academic library, just string the numbers out as far as you need to go until you can have your shelf list and your shelves organized in a way that makes sense and everything fits in there in the subject that they should. That's a possibility too, and that's sort of what we'll focus on for this class. We'll just string out Dewey in terms of those base call numbers and then the rest of the call number. So that's sort of what we will focus on for this class. But I am aware that there are a lot of different approaches in terms of how you can do that last part of it. Basic principle of library classification is to group items on the shelf according to their subject content, or sometimes by their literary or bibliographic form. And there is a little bit you can do with Dewey with the bibliographic form and with literature, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of go through our exercises. Examples of classification, we've already talked some about these. Obviously, we're going to be talking about Dewey a lot. If you think you're supposed to be in a different class besides Dewey, then you may have signed up for something else. We're going to be talking about Dewey in this class. There's also something called Universal Decimal Classification, UDC. Of course, there's the Library of Congress classification, LCC, and then there's also subject-specific ones. MESH, which is the National Library of Medicine. There's the NLM classification that goes with the MESH subject headings, MESH being the medical, ME, medical subject headings, and so the NLM, National Library of Medicine, goes along with those MESH headings typically. And then there's engineering information. There's also national general schemas. So if you are if you work for some kind of government agency, you may have your own classification. There's several different like occupation classifications, things like that. Industries have a lot of times have their own classifications. I worked when I was right after I graduated with my MLS, I worked in a temporary position in the manufacturing industry in their library as their sort of manager of their library while they were sort of looking for what they were going to do with that position. And they had a very different classification schema and a very different metadata schema that was not library oriented at all. It was an industry standard for that manufacturing, those manufacturing goods that they made. So that was really interesting to kind of see how it was the same but different. So really any organization that we may apply on top of a group of resources is a classification scheme. If it has any kind of organization and structure to it, then it would fall into that. Of course, library classification, we really are trying our best to put related items together in a way that is useful through providing an ease of searching or browsing. And then, so that's the first part, ease of use, that people can find what they're looking for, and that also establishes an order for that collection. So, those two things kind of work hand in hand. And that first piece of it, putting related items together in a way that is useful, that is those Ferber user tasks. So the Ferber being the functional requirements for bibliographic records, it's one of the foundations of RDA. And that piece of it really, that sort of piece of the Ferber universe really does talk about like how the information we create serves our users and how do we help the user find what they're looking for. So can they find it? Can they identify that they found the right thing? Can they find the most relevant or the best thing that they're looking for that matches their searching needs and what they need? So how can we be part of that process? And so library classification gets into that Ferber task too, in that we are trying to put related items together in a way that's useful. And then of course the other part of it, that we're also trying to organize our collection. And so sometimes organizing our collection is for our users. We organize it in a way that's logical, putting things that are in the same subject together. A lot of times, if you have special collections, or maybe you put your AV together in a separate collection, that's for our users as well. Looking at how we can break our collections up so that they can better address the user need. And then, of course, there's the other part of it is we need an organized collection too, so that we know what we have, right? So that inventory process. So, library classification and how we label things, what kind of, not only a physical label we put on it, but what kind of label do we put on it in terms of a number, in terms of a notation? Those all do play into that Ferber user task of can they find what they're looking for? Because if we have not done a good job of classifying something, of putting that call number on it, and we're going to look at some examples later in terms of sort of how that can work on the shelf, if we haven't done a good job of it, people may not be able to find it. If we give it the wrong number, if we put it in our number doesn't match the subject, if we make a typo, all of those things can impede someone being able to find it. Of course, classification and information retrieval, so looking, what are people looking for, that does support category searching because we create categories. And so in the process of using a classification scheme that has a hierarchy, So it has categories, those classes I talked about. So it has those categories. All of those categories and all of that hierarchy that's in place also then helps our users, because it's easier for them to sort of broaden their search or narrow their search. Sometimes you can do that right in the stacks, right? You go look in a particular area, especially if you're like in a large library with a large collection. And we're really kind of thinking about nonfiction right now, things that would be, classified and have subjects and be grouped by subjects, whereas fiction, that's a little bit of a challenge into itself. But when you think about like nonfiction and you're looking for it, it's pretty easy, regardless what kind of library you're in, that if you're in a particular section of nonfiction, you can kind of look around and you'll see related things around you. And that is because of that hierarchy and that structure that's in place with those categories in place. There are a lot of different kinds of ways that we organize classification systems. There's category production systems, there's a fixed category structure where you have subject classification and category schemes. And we are lucky, I think, in the fact that our classification schemes, while sort of structured, and they are tied to specific subjects, at the same time it's flexible enough so that you can use something different. So you can, for example, you can use, and we've already had some discussion of this, you can use Dewey classification and the Library of Congress subject headings together. So as long as you've got a match between that subject and that classification, our systems are flexible enough that we can do that kind of thing. Classification is never purely subject matter, but it's really a combination of the subject. And this gets to a little bit of that subject analysis, like what is it about? What is your item about? And that's really, what classification at that sort of big level, sort of that macro level is about. It's about determining what is the best numbering or whatever coding you're going to use to represent that subject, so what that item is about. And then other things like other attributes like genre and the form of it, the audience, and things like that. And of course, then the other part of it that kind of happens in that process too is determining which attributes are necessary and sufficient for a given object, a given piece of information, a given resource. Now, for most of us, when we are cataloging, we're going to do that subject analysis part first. So we're going to decide what our subjects are. And so then when we go to do our call number part of it, we already know what our subject's about. We already know what form it is. We know if it's a guidebook. We know if it's periodical. We've made all those decisions first. And so then when we go to do our cuttering and do our creating our notation to figure out what the call number is going to be, we kind of have those pieces in place. So we've made it a little bit easier for ourselves because we've broken up that process. Now, if you are working from a record in OCLC, again, you already have some subjects probably, hopefully, in place. If not, you're going to do your subject analysis first, and then you're going to use that as the basis for developing your call number and cuttering or extending your call number as needed. But you really do have to determine what attributes can be or should be chosen in a given category system, and then look at the relationships of the attributes in the resource, the informational resource. And so, this is one of those areas, and it's true for cataloging too. It's true for subject analysis as well. When you get to things that are sort of a hodgepodge, multiple things put together, kits, games, web pages, things like that can be a little bit more difficult to kind of figure out how to represent them. Category production systems make a list of information resource categories with a low-level organization. And then when you search, you have to search the list for the candidate categories. It is possible to do some post-retrieval. So after you have pulled up the list of your categories, usually there's a way to kind of group or organize them together, and it does allow you to search across those characteristics and attributes. And this is an interesting, it's kind of a really old school way of thinking about searching, that you sort of do this search on the fly and then it search through your categories and that kind of puts them together and then it kind of gets dumped along the way. So fixed classification or classificatory structures, and we've already looked at some examples of this, something that's just completely alphabetical, something that is alphabetical with or without relationships shown, and then a system with a hierarchy. And so, of course, we know from looking at, if you've already done your readings, you know that looking at Dewey, it is a hierarchy. And in fact, looking at the Web Dewey little overview, I talked about the hierarchy and we looked at the hierarchy. So spoiler alert, you already know it has a hierarchy. But there are other structures out there available too. So this is kind of a structure that you might see. You might even see it at the back of like a back of a book, like an index kind of thing. So it can't even be like an index. Indexing is a little bit more than just this kind of thing, but it can be something like this. Sometimes if you are looking at a website, they may have a list like this and you can kind of click and go to things. Dictionaries and encyclopedias and things like that will sometimes have lists like this. And so it's a list that's just words and there sort of has a hierarchy a little bit thrown into it. And we see here we have like submarines, and then we have choices like diesel engine, electric motor, nuclear powered. You know, so you have a little bit of hierarchies. The class structure maintains is the same on each level, meaning that power-driven warships and power-driven craft are on the, I think, the same level. Look like they're the same level, but essentially the top categories are all equal. So, you know, the top categories are all equal and then everything falls below it. So there's not kind of like a master hierarchy with, you know, something at the top that's everything and then there's the categories underneath. Instead, you have things that are equal. All categories are placed in a single alphabetical sequence regardless of their conceptual relationships to each other. So there's not as much, when you look at this, there's not as much in terms of a way to build relationships between things. And you do have things, sometimes you'll have things like we have in the subject guides and the subject schedules. You'll have things like you've used for broader terms, narrower terms, related terms. So you have that sort of thing in terms of how things are organized. But again, you don't have the ability to build relationships between things as much. So class, we've already talked about this a little bit. I've already loosely defined it as a category. So it is a category under which representations of informational resources can be listed. A chain is a sequential pair of classes where each pair consists of an upper and a lower. So a chain is really just looking at that hierarchy. An array is how the successive classes under a common superordinate, so that'd be the one above, or they can be called co-coordinate classes. So when you look here, it's going to be kind of hard to see, I think, but when you look here, you can see chain at the top. And let me go back for that. You can see chain at the top, so that's sort of your hierarchy. And then when you have things that are equivalent, that's an array. Basic structure here, and this is the same sort of structure you'll see when you start looking in Dewey in terms of a hierarchy. You have that superordinate or the class that's at the top, and then you have your sort of equal classes, and then down below that, and we could even chain down here. We could even have more going on here and more going on here, but everything that is level is going to be an array, regardless if there's anything below it. So everything that would be equal would be an array. This is just another example. This is kind of chaining it out a little bit more. So here we have the array. So these are the classes that are equal. And then we have this one has a little chain going down. And then again, we have another class that is equal. And so this is just why this is useful to know in terms of Dewey is when you start looking at the schedules, and WebDewey, I think, makes it a little bit easier because you can jump around a little bit and you can search a little bit more, but being able to understand the structure is going to be useful. So your first sort of exercise is really going to be focused on understanding the structure of Dewey and being able to see that hierarchy. And part of the reason why it's important to know is because if you need to use the print schedules, or if you are in a place where you do not have access to WebDewey and you need to use the print schedules, being able to follow the hierarchy is just critical. In WebDewey, like I said, it's a little bit easier, but sometimes knowing the hierarchy and being able to trace the hierarchy is incredibly useful when you're trying to sort out a piece of information. Or if you're trying to figure out if you've gone granular enough, like is there a more specific notation for my subject? You know, knowing whether or not you've gone granular enough, sometimes knowing that hierarchy and seeing where that particular chain ends is useful to know as well. So it's useful information to know. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about, you know, opportunities in classification, like why do we do this work? I mean, obviously we talked about so you could have a call number and stick it on the shelf. I mean, that's an easy one, right? And so that our users can find things, those Ferber user tasks. And, you know, those two are kind of the big buckets in terms of why we choose to do this. To organize work in a way that is logical, so it makes our work logical. To lead our users naturally towards those broader or narrower terms. And then we already talked a little bit about how subject headings can be tied to a call number classification. Call number classifications can be other things. You can have a local arrangement, let's say for your DVD collection, where you give it DVD 1, DVD 2, DVD 3, and the only relationship between that call number you've given it and the item that it's attached to, maybe the fact that you've numbered them 1 from the time the first one came in and 57 is the last one that came in. So it's a chronological order. Or you may have something where you use like the last 6 digits of the barcode. And so it is a number that is tied to the barcode sequence. Depending on how you get those in, that may be chronological or it may be kind of random, but it's in the number that you get those barcodes. So, you know, we haven't talked too much about that kind of call number classification where it is not tied to subjects, but it exists out there in the library world and in many library worlds. So you may have something where you are, for your works of fiction, maybe you just use F or FIC for fiction, and then you just cutter the 3 digits of the author's last name. And that's how you cutter your fiction. And that is logical, and it is a physical arrangement of materials, but it's not tied to the subject, it's tied to the author's name. You may do something that is tied to the subject and then cutter to be more granular. So you give it its Dewey call number, and then it's you know, cuttered by the last 3 characters of the author's name. And that way, that's still tied to the subject first, as long as you're doing that kind of work. But there's other kinds of classification. We're going to be centered and focused on classifying using Dewey tied to subjects. So we're not going to look at those other kinds of things. We'll talk a little bit about them through the course of the 4 weeks, but we're not going to do that kind of classification because it differs in every library. One of the things that having a classified system can do, regardless what kind of classified system it is, it can encourage browsing and that serendipity of discovery. And of course, it can also help people expand their vocabulary and terms in terms of what they're searching for. If you have somebody who comes in who's searching for a very scientific term, then having the subjects and materials classed together in a way may lead them to discover other terms that would be terms that are actually used in subject analysis, or it might lead them to other related terms in a different way. Of course, some challenges in classification. I think these are kind of a no-brainer, but some challenges in classification. You know, while it is a logical division of materials, it can split up collections of related materials. I think we've all seen the challenges of trying to use Dewey for fiction, how that can be kind of not always the best fit, and we sometimes do some little massaging of it and kind of tweaking of that last part of it to get things to be nice on the shelf and to make sense to people. Graphic novels, if you just cutter them and you follow the cutter, and then you may separate out topics. So there's all kinds of if you take any of the like the Marvel or DC comics, there's so many characters in each one of those, and they have so many different series and runs. And if you start cataloging and classifying them all in Dewey, you may find them separated out rather than putting everything by the Joker to get everything about the Joker together. You've kind of separated things out in different ways. It's not always a logical subdivision of classes, and you'll see that in the course of looking at things. In fact, in the Web Dewey example, when we looked at dogs, that's a perfect example where it's like, doesn't quite seem logical. There can be a delay in updating terms and updating classification numbers, especially with new areas of interest. And this is hard for subject analysis too. And the term that's used for subjects and thus has the number related to it is not always going to match what our users are looking for. Looking at Dewey specifically, I loved this, but how and where do you store these things? Or how do you store these bits, I think is what it says. I think that is sort of the heart of what Dewey was attempting to achieve. And of course, we're talking about 1876-ish. He was looking at developing a knowledge organization tool. His was actually the first. It predated the Library of Congress by 22 years, I think. And so he's really looking at how we could organize our resources and provide access to libraries' collections, and then also how we could create a browsing mechanism. Of course, he was before the days of the web, but how can you create that browsing experience? It is the most widely used classification system in the world still, and it is used by all kinds of libraries. As of 2011, it is only updated online. So if you have an older version, one thing you'll notice is some of the terms may differ. But so you may have to, if you're cataloging something new and you're using what would be an updated term, then you may have to search a little bit harder, and you may even want to go look in OCLC or look in the authorities or something like that to see if you can figure out what the term updated to so that you can assign your proper number. So print's going to be a little tiny bit outdated. The main difference, I think, between the print and Web Dewey, for one, if you're using the print, you really got to study the hierarchy and follow the hierarchies carefully. I can't stress that enough. The hierarchies are the way that you will determine what notation you will use, what your base call number will be, as well as how that notation works. In WebDewey, you can get a little bit of cheats. You get a little bit of help. You can type in your term. You can just type in your subject heading, for that matter, from your record, if you have a record with a subject heading already. And then you can see, it may be in there exactly as it is. It depends. If you're using Library of Congress subject headings, then you may not find it exactly, but sometimes there'll be an exact match, and it will at least start you in the hierarchy. I will say, if you're looking at Library of Congress subject headings and trying to figure out what the Dewey correlation is, I would start with the more general subject heading and kind of work from there. That might be the easier way to find a match. The other thing I'll mention too is that if you have classification web, it's not required for this class, and we don't have access for it for this particular class, but if you do have access to classification web, there is a Dewey correlation in there, and that's very helpful. And there's a lot more support for Dewey that's just sort of part of that Library of Congress schedules that are in there. So there's that correlation between the Library of Congress and Dewey that you can use as a tool. You can use any tool that you have at your disposal. You all have access to WebDewey through this class, and so I would suggest that you become familiar with WebDewey, because going forward, if you are cataloging in a library, and I think most of you are already cataloging with Dewey, but if you are cataloging in a library that is you're assigning Dewey numbers, then you really do need to have access to that WebDewey. And having a little bit more experience using it, you might be able to make a case for it if your library does not buy it for you. In terms of how it's organized, the print, there's volume 1, which has the introduction, the manual, special tables, and changes. That information is all kind of at the bottom of WebDewey, as we saw in that demo that I went through. Volume 2 and 3 is where you find your schedule text. That's where you kind of dig into how you create that base call number and that notation. And then the summaries are just very helpful and important all the way around. There is an abridged version. If you are just doing like a quick lookup and you just kind of want to see, like, you have a record already and it has a Dewey call number and you think the record looks good, but you just want to verify it real quick, certainly WebDewey is a super easy way to do that. You can just type in the number. But if you don't have that, the abridged version is going to probably be sufficient for that kind of thing. It is a little bit behind, but it is something that you can use. They do work on updating Dewey regularly, so WebDewey is now being updated. The Dewey in print is no longer being updated. So what is included in the DDC? That includes call number notations. That's the notations that we've been talking about, the numbers, and then subject headings. So you can see the subject heading sort of correlating to that within that. We already mentioned that you could switch back and forth between Dewey subject headings, Library of Congress call numbers, the other way around. It's a little bit easier to use Library of Congress subject headings with a Dewey call number than do the other way around. We talked about this already, sort of Dewey in practice, but here's a little example of Dewey in practice. So this library actually does multiple things in their arrangement. Actually, I grabbed the LC slide. Okay, well, I'll update it with the Dewey slide before I send this on. But this library does do multiple things, so just pretend I put the Dewey slide in there. Somehow I've replaced it with the LC slide. But one thing that we can note is that you can actually do things like, when you get further down in your Dewey call number, you can actually do things like cutter by the author, or you can some people put dates at the end of records and end of call numbers and things like that. So, Dewey is a hierarchy, and we've already talked a bit about this. Subjects are divided from most general to most specific. And then the schedules are the divisions arranged in number order. So the schedules are sort of the list that you'll see. In WebDewey, you have to work a little bit harder, I think, to see the list, or it may be a little easier depending upon what your point of view is. Whereas I think when you're looking at the print, you can really see like the hierarchy in the list. It's called a world of knowledge. That's sort of what we call Dewey as a whole, the world of knowledge. That's kind of awesome, isn't it? And it's divided into 10 main classes, and we're going to look at those classes. It goes from 000 to 900, and those classes are then subdivided. So that means making more granular, and then there's the relative index. So it's arranged by discipline. Any specific topic can appear in any number of disciplines. And for example, if you have a work on families, it can be classed in a number of different disciplines. It really depends upon what it's about, and what the emphasis is. Is it about families themselves? Is it about history? Is it about family therapy? Is it about, or is it, about families as a whole? So kind of thinking about that, when you are looking at a topic, one of the things you'll look at when you're looking at your subject headings to figure out like what is it about? Then you're also going to be thinking about like how does it fit into the schedule, and you're not just going to go in and search families and like pick the first one and say like, all right, there's my base Dewey number, I'm going to go to it. You need to really look to see where it fits in that schedule and that hierarchy, and make sure that you've chosen an appropriate usage. If you are cataloging from an existing record, or if you are assigning that notation from an existing record, so you have a record in OCLC that you're going to use, or that you're going to sort of copy some things from, maybe you have a different edition or something like that, the first subject heading is typically the one that's going to be what you're going to assign your call number and what you're going to create that notation off of. If you are using a Library of Congress subject heading and you're trying to figure out like what it would be in Dewey, then you might need to go more general to begin with, but you're going to want to go granular to get to that first subject heading, because that first subject heading is going to be the most specific in a record that's in OCLC, and it should match your subject heading. Should match your base call number. Now, if you have some other kind of arrangement where you are doing something different with like fiction, like you put all the fiction together and then you cut her some other different way, then you're just going to do what you do for that stuff, that particular category of material. If you do something different with DVDs where you pull them all together and you call them M for movies, and then you cut her by the director, you're just going to keep doing what you do for that in your daily work. But for class, we're going to keep to a subject cataloging philosophy in terms of how we create our call numbers. So here's an example of looking at family. So 173 is ethics of family relationships. 241.63, that is Christian family ethics. We have marriage and family planning. There are all kinds of different sort of flavors of family histories. So family histories are separate, or in a whole different group, a whole different class than marriage and family. And it's in a different class than family psychotherapy. Now, why would you think that family histories would be so far away from family psychotherapy? Well, think about what those two things are about. Family histories, that would be like, letters, genealogy works, diaries, memoirs, family histories. And what would be family psychotherapy? That would be about therapy of the family, right? So it's going to be that very therapeutic, it's going to focus on that therapy aspect. And so it's going to go into that category, where family history is going to go into more of a history category. The 10 main classes, you will get familiar with these, very familiar with these. And what they look like, you've probably seen something really that looks like this. You may have something hanging up in your library that looks like this. Something that's a very adorable graphic that communicates really well to our patrons what those big buckets are. What does the world of knowledge look like? and just at the highest levels. So there's lots of graphics that look like this in terms of, sort of laying out what those main classes are. And I think sometimes we just see this kind of stuff so much we don't think about the back end of it, like, yeah, that's the main classes, but now we got a lot more to go from. So each class is further divided into 10 divisions, and each division is divided into 10 sections. So there's 999 classes in all. This is to make it more specific, and as the number expands, so as you add past that decimal point, it moves from general to specific. And DDC uses the decimal point. It's really, that just is to make it even more specific. So, as you go from 600 to 620 to 629, that each place gets more specific. And then past the decimal, each place gets more specific. So for you start out with 3 digits. So that's your sort of your base number. And then the third digit is really what introduces those standard subdivisions. And we'll talk a lot more about the standard subdivisions next week. We're just kind of exploring a little bit of all of this today. So for example, we have science. Science is in the 500 to 599 range. And then 501 to 509 is where those standard subdivisions will fit. And so that pattern actually exists throughout Dewey, that 600 to 699 is the technology bucket. And there's a lot of things that go in technology, as we saw from the Web Dewey exploration. 600 to 699, and then that 601 to 609 is where our standard subdivisions. There are longer numbers with standard subdivisions. It gets really complicated quickly. So what do? You follow the class schedule. You read everything you need to read. You follow the class schedule. You break it down as much as you can, and we'll talk more about how to do that in the next couple of weeks. You break it down as much as you can, and for the purposes of creating the notation through that subject lens, we're going to just continue to extend it out as much as we need to for the practices of this exercise. Like I said, you may cutter and do some other things beyond that in your own work, and that's fine to continue to do that. An ideal arrangement in terms of category structure and subject areas, an ideal arrangement, and it is one that is starting to really become a little bit more organized in Dewey, is that you have the subject and its number. Well, we have that anyway. I mean, that's kind of existed for a long time, but standard subdivisions for forms, and then the principles of the subject areas, and then those stated subdivisions. So in other words, they're looking at how they can make it a little bit more consistent. Now, why do you think it would be less consistent? Well, part of the reason why it's less consistent is because, like, hello, was it 1867? That was a long time ago. I don't think anybody, probably Melville Dewey, had no idea what we would be doing with his notation system he created way back in the day. No idea. But part of it is it's evolved over time. And so as our collections have grown, and there's things that exist in the world now that just could not have possibly been envisioned back in the 19th century. There's just no way it could possibly have been envisioned. And so, one of the things they're working on now is doing some standardizing of patterns. But for your purposes of what you're working on, you're just going to follow what the schedule says. Now, if you have a really old collection, you may notice that things don't quite sit where they seem like they should. And, if you have some things that were, like, say you have some materials that were cataloged at the beginning of sort of the internet age, at the beginning of automation, you have some old computer manuals and things like that maybe floating around, those may not kind of sit where you think they should now compared to their their siblings out in your collection. So, they are working on standardizing patterns, and they do work on expanding and updating them. But sometimes libraries get those materials before, before the classification schedules have been updated. And so that is a challenge in terms of, what do you do? And really what you do is you do the best job you can for now, knowing that at some point someone may have to go back and fix it. It's just as likely as that what you're doing is a very contemporary topic, an emerging technologies kind of topic. It may just be as likely that libraries will withdraw it before they ever have to fix it. So there's that. And just know that our predecessors who came before us, and that we may be fixing their things now, they did the best job that they could in their situation at that time. They may have had no idea that graphic novels would become so big. They may have no idea, and in fact, if you look at how the Library of Congress has cataloged a lot of graphic novels, the subdivision is comic books and something else, etc. I can't remember what the next part of it is, but they typically have a form subdivision for comic books, which of course we know is not an accurate statement when it comes to graphic novels. And we also know that there's nonfiction in graphic novels, and there's graphic novels that are not juvenile. There's a lot of those, in fact. So the expectations for what people assumed about those materials in the beginning has not really kept up with where those materials have gone and how that industry has developed. So we make the best we can at the time and do the best cataloging, the best classification we can at the time. So here's an example of animal husbandry, and this is a good example to look at in terms of a pattern. So when you look in WebDewey, you'll look under, you can even just type in animal husbandry, you can type in 636, whichever works for you. It's volume 3 in the print. And so when you look the 001 to 009, that's the standard subdivisions. And then you look at the 01 to the 089, that's special subdivisions. And then the 0.1 to 0.9 is for animal husbandry of specific animals. So they have created this sort of tweak this one to be the pattern that they're envisioning the rest of things going. Now, there's a lot to do. When you change classification numbers, that means things that we've cataloged in the past are not necessarily going to have the correct classification number, so there's maintenance. So anytime you change subject headings or change classification schemes or change the classification numbers, it creates this sort of cascading flow of work that kind of rolls right downhill to your desk. So overall workflow, I would like for you all to really spend some time looking at this, and I want you to be able to think about this and have this as part of your logical workflow. I think this is such a good diagram of how to go through the process. So find your starting number or span. You may not actually have a number. You may just think like, okay, I think it goes in the 600s. It's technology. That may be as much as you get, and that's fine. Find your starting spot. And then once you find that, you're going to work your way through. Now, this is actually how to do it in WebDewey, and it gives you the, go through the number building kind of exercise and things like that. But you can do it that way. So this would be actually how you would actually create your number if you're going to create it in WebDewey. But this process, this thinking process, to me is what I want you to get down. And I have always been, when I've cuttered, when I have, I've cuttered tons of, I can't even count how much stuff I've probably cuttered over my career. But anyway, that's an aside. But I've done a lot of classification, a lot of cutting, and I have always found that having having my resource open that I'm going to be using, if it's Library of Congress classification, if it's Dewey classification, having that resource, getting my base call number and extending out as far as I need to go there. And then if I need to go to a cutter tables using those Sanborn cutter tables, if I'm doing that, I do that part of the process. And then my final step is I go to my own library catalog and I browse for my call number to make sure I'm not creating a call number conflict. make sure the call number that I'm giving for that resource is unique. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of that workflow as we kind of go forward the next couple of weeks. But it's something I just want you to kind of think about, like what the workflow here. This is for creating that Dewey call number. Like what's that process? And I would add down here where it's like contribute to Dewey editors, that's for you, those of you who are going to be doing that work. But I would also add down here at the bottom, what is my internal workflow for Dewey? What is my internal, do I have any local procedures that would change what I've done here? Do I have any local decisions in terms of, do I cutter or do I not? Do I extend out as many characters, as many digits as I need to, or do I truncate? Do I go out, let's say, I worked in one library and no matter what, we did not go out more than 9 digits. That was the 9 digits past the decimal was the max. And so, then what do you do in that situation if you're going to have two things that have the same? And when you lop off sometimes digits, you can impact the meaning of that call number. And so, how do you deal with that? So what are your local processes in terms of how far out you go if you have that local procedure? If you don't have that local procedure, do you just go out for as long as you need to, or do you cutter? Do you go out so many digits and then you cutter? And at what point do you truncate? Do you truncate when you get to the main class, and when you get to your base call number, you go out a couple more digits and that's it? And then you do your cuttering, that kind of thing. Do you add a date if you have titles that are the same that are published different, different editions that are published different years? Do you add a date to separate them out? All of that kind of stuff. So that's not really included in this workflow, that sort of local practice in terms of what you do. But this is a good overview in terms of getting started and then looking to see, do you need to add additional information, verifying the call number is going to be correct. Do you need to add any additional terms, that kind of thing. So kind of guiding you through that process. And on that note, thank you for being in class, and I've seen some good discussion already, and I look forward to talking to everyone for class 2, which I will have ready by Monday. And have a good day and a good rest of the week. Thank you.